Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Perfusion Musings, the podcast from Envello Medical, where we're diving into the science of perfusion, oximetry, and the future of cardiovascular care. I'm Casey Boutwell, the CEO here at Envello Medical.
And I'm Dan Rodenhaver. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer. And today we are joined by a close friend of ours. It's Erin Davis, who's a nurse at the University of Utah. And she currently serves in the Cardiothoracic Transplant, Mechanical Circulatory Support, and Advanced Heart Failure Program Manager at the university. So Erin is a advisor to us at Envello, but also one of our earliest contacts in the cardiovascular space. And we're honored to have you on the podcast. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Dan and Casey. It's been fun to get to know you guys over the last few years. So,
yeah, we really appreciate your engagement with us and helping us learn. I was, actually just thinking about how you are one of our longest advisors in helping us understand this space. And although I have a whole bunch of questions I want to ask, I think maybe people would be interested in understanding how you and Dan originally got connected.
with interesting at HFSA, I got asked to do a speaking on a panel for remote patient monitoring and how do you take care of patients in rural populations. And then all of a sudden, this guy that didn't look like he was a doc and didn't look like he was a nurse came up and asked me some questions after and introduced himself as a previous military guy. And I thought that was kind of an interesting conversation. Never been approached by somebody like Dan, but we got talking and I think my passion exuded out of me and like flooded him with a lot of information about cardiovascular care. So.
Yeah, it was an interesting, you were absolutely correct. I don't know if I should be encouraged by that I don't look like a medical provider or not, but I certainly wasn't. I've been in and around medicine for a long time, but I didn't know anything about cardiovascular disease, and HFSA was just 3 days of just learning and learning and learning. But you're at the time, because our background is in sort of remote patient care for the military, what you were talking about was really important to me. So can you sort of jump into that a little bit and like what you saw initially from not necessarily what our product is, but what you were talking about there, the challenges that go with your patient population?
So my background in cardiovascular medicine is very heavy in the MCS space, which is advanced, the final stage. You either get transplant or an LVAD, and then you possibly can die. And heart failure being the #1 killer in men and women in the U.S., a lot of effort goes into studying this disease, especially in the big cities. Even Salt Lake, the big city of the West, right, does a lot of research in this. We can talk about that later. But what people don't understand is there are a lot of states and in the U.S. that do not have access to the most advanced heart failure care. They may be even 10 to 15 years behind the times. And so how do we as big centers share our knowledge with these patients in their communities instead of forcing the patients to come to the big cities, which they don't want to do? Most rural population patients, farmers, and hard workers in their own towns don't want to leave their cities and their towns and their areas. And we're talking more than 25% of the U.S. continental space that does not have access to this care. So my passion is how do we bring this to them? And you can create shared care models between large centers and these smaller rural communities with the help of providers, both APPs, APCs, PAs, and MDs all the way across, and nurses across the U.S. to actually get this care to these patients that need it. And so we were talking a lot of, it can be done. You don't have to force the patient to move. And that was kind of the whole premise of this discussion, this panel, HFSA, is how do you get heart failure care to them, the advanced heart failure care.
Yeah, you're clearly very passionate about it. And your passion for it is helping to direct our enthusiasm and our desire to help. We've got capabilities, but we often need to be focused on those capabilities. And you, along with the rest of our scientific advisors, have been very helpful in getting us there. Your position is actually pretty unique as well. You're a nurse. You had spent a lot of time at the bedside. You still spend a lot of time at the bedside. You're also an administrator. And so I'm curious how you balance both the big center with your rural interest, as well as the nursing perspective and the administrative perspective, and how you advocate between all of those different constituencies to try and tie them all together. Tell us more about that experience.
Medicine is an art form, right? So we have lots of protocols, we have lots of rules we follow, we have all this data we can get, but ultimately it comes down to what your why is. And I talk to my team a lot about what's your why. The day you lose your why is the day you should retire or move on to something else. And so For the first part of my years, I was bedside nurse, and my why was the patient, the individual patient I was seeing right then and in front of me. Still love that patient, still need to care for them. But as I grew and we started a LVAD program and it grew very big, and I went over to transplant, I actually did a stint with industry. I came back to the University of Utah, love the University of Utah and the mission it has to serve these patients, all patients. I realized my why is changing. Instead of directly serving one patient, if I became an administrator, a good administrator, because we've had good and bad, right? I could influence other nurses, other providers to have that same passion. I could develop them so that they can care for the patient. So now we're looking at the patient in a bigger population. Instead of the single patient, we now can look at an entire group of patients and entire states of patients to care for. So that's why I like being a nurse administrator. I like to have my clinical background. Some of my providers would say I'm a little too clinical. Sometimes I need to stay in my own lane, but that's what makes me good is I remember being a bedside nurse. I remember caring for that one individual patient. And now we can translate it through policy, advocating in policy through other industries, through speaking nationally, through working with partners across the US to actually deliver this care to a bigger population and not just what happened at the University of Utah in that one patient room.
Yeah, I imagine it also magnifies your impact when you talk about the rural populations. You have this expertise being in the sort of center of excellence in this region where you have to bring in patients who sometimes have to fly for their care. And it helps you advocate and I would imagine also mentor some of the nurses in those more rural, less well-resourced environments where sometimes they just have to figure out what to do with what they have. And you've been there. And so I imagine you can build trust pretty quickly with them.
You mentioned
That's my
Erin.
background. So that's those are my patients. Those are my neighbors that I grew up with.
Yeah. You mentioned speaking nationally, and you've done a lot of research. And did that sort of transition to that sort of work? Did that work happen after you switched away from the bedside? Is it challenging to do both as a bedside nurse and then and that type of research? And what was that transition like? And where do you want to go with some of that?
That's a good question. I would never put myself as a researcher, but I love participating with other researchers. I definitely have no desire for my PhD and MBA is enough. But as a bedside nurse, it's very hard to get involved in that. You can if you want to do extra. It's kind of this extra thing you do. Bedside nurses are the boots on the ground. They run all over the place all the time. When I transitioned to the coordinator role, especially in my program as we were growing it, we had the opportunity to have I don't know, downtime, not really downtime, but we were able to say, okay, this didn't work. What can we make this better? And my first really introduction to research was I had physicians that led me and said, hey, would you like to join us on this paper? And my whole point of the paper was just to read over it at the end. And they put my name on it. I was like, well, that was pretty cool. And so I kind of enjoyed that. I loved the editing part. And then I started joining national groups. So ICCAC is the International Consortium of Circulatory Assist Clinicians, big long word, ICAC. Back in 2006, it was a bunch of LVAD nurses. We didn't have a society, and we bonded together, and now there's greater than 600 members internationally in this society. But they drive research from that society, nurse-driven research, and APRNs and bedside RNs, and they help nurses translate the research because a lot of times these physicians get in their labs and they have all this data that goes way above our heads, and nurses can actually translate that research into actually what matters to the patient at the bedside. So I love transitional research. I love translational research. I love being able to bring it back to the patient level. And I haven't driven pure research on my own, but I love participating with others. And then I like the editing part. How will this actually impact? And so even working with you guys and teaching you guys and leading in the cardiovascular space and having you guys tie us with other physicians across the US is we can actually talk in real time and have the experts actually drive new innovation. It's not always through industry that big things happen. It's through PIs, these physicians and these investigators and these nurse investigators that say, I have a problem and I think I have a solution. So I really enjoy that part.
Yeah, so it sounds like that's fantastic. I didn't know about a lot of that. It sounds like that's sort of organic, built from the nurses getting together and saying, hey, we want to have some input on this. How can like industry or even physician research sort of draw on that experience and just say, also get involved in that transition? You and I've talked many times about we need to make sure it's not just sort of the theoretical, what can we do in the end, but can it actually fit the workflows? How do we draw that nurse experience into not just our company, but
I
others.
think, I think keeping an open mind from an industry partner and the physician partner, that just because we can doesn't mean we should. And then what is the right patient? How would this actually impact the patients and the end users? So we can come up with all sorts of data. We can provide all sorts of fancy technology or labs or all these biomarkers and things. But if we can't actually relate it back to why it matters to the patient and what will this do for future generations, and then how do you actually bring it to the bedside? The nurses are often the ones that have to initiate newfound research, whether it's a new device, whether it's a new medication, whether it's a new monitoring system. The nurses are going to be probably the end users. So I think bringing nurses onto advisory panels early on for all industry partners, whatever type of partner it is, and asking them what their thoughts are. If you talk to any of our physicians here, they would never presume to be able to initiate anything without nurses involved. And I really appreciate that about the U. We're very much considered equal colleagues to the rest of the MDs, PhDs, all the different providers that we have. So I think that's the most important from the industry side, is to bring nurses on early on. And then it's a kind of a scary and a little bit intimidating. So you have to make it welcoming, and you have to have mentorship between nurse researchers to nurse researchers to help them feel more confident to do things like this, to actually, put their ideas out there and speak up and be heard.
So this is Perfusion Musings after all. So let's talk about some of that stuff. What do you see? Where are nurses challenged today? Where are patients challenged today? What are some of the things that you're seeing in the ICUs and critical care patients that we need improvement in?
I think we've come a long way in the last 20 years that I've been in this field. In GDMT and the best care for patients, we've come up with a lot of best practices. There's been a lot of national published research about cardiogenic shock or advanced heart failure and all the different aspects that go into that, all the different sub-diseases. I think where sometimes we fail our patients is just because some national paper says this, we can't just translate that to every single patient out there. Each patient's going to react differently to whatever medication, device, intervention you put on them. And so I think my experience in heart failure is we have to look at the patient individually. We have to use the national data, and then we have to try something else when it doesn't work. We can't just assume that one size fits all. I think when you were visiting with Craig in another podcast, he mentioned that GDMT can be applied to these patients and they may or may not react. And then we need to study why, and we need to adapt instantaneously. It's an art form. It's not we can standardize the process, but it's still an art form for the patient. So in my mind, I really enjoy the aspect of collaborating with the physicians, with the pharmacists, with the dietitians, with social workers, and finding out what actually works for a patient and what they need and how this therapy that we study nationally actually translates to the real population. When we put on big national trials, that's the perfect population because that's how it's designed. You handpicked your patients. There's inclusion criteria, there's exclusion criteria. But when you actually translate that medicine, then whatever that intervention is, to the real population, we have to study that. We have to keep learning from that, what happened to that population.
I think that's a really great point, especially for people who are developing new technologies. Sometimes the technology inventors and the technology adopters just don't know the answer between the two of them. Hey, we have this measure. How should it change? Oh, I don't know. We've never had that measure. Okay, well, let's make the measure and then figure out how to use the measure and then figure out if it's useful. And so that's sort of our, that's why we're so excited about working in perfusion, is that people generally know what perfusion is and it's important, but how much perfusion is enough perfusion? We don't really know. Are we giving enough perfusion right now? Are we over perfusing? Is that a problem? We don't really know. And so it seems it's just like this really topical aspect. It's sort of the root of all of our functional physiology. We should probably try and figure it out. And that's really the purpose of this podcast, is to talk about that uncertainty. And another one of the aspects about your experience that's sort of drawn me to you as an advisor is that because nurses are really like the hands of healthcare, so frequently right there touching and delivering the patients, you have seen a lot of failures too in technologists that didn't really consider not only the patient's outcomes, but also the adoption practices and how many buttons a nurse would have to push and how sticky the thing is going to be and how hard it is to clean. And can you tell us about some of those failures and I think immediately all of us listening to this podcast and here talk to nurses early is one potential solution. But any other ways that people have kind of overcome those?
Yeah, I mean, I've been around and seen the technologies come on and be really excited. I've seen them fail for lots of reasons. Maybe the technology wasn't the problem. It could have been the company running the technology might have been had some issues. I think, oh, that's a hard question, Casey. And I've thought about this one for a while, is if I could go back in time, how would I have done something different, right? You always have hindsight. And when I think back about the failures, I think we forgot, either we were too money driven, us in general, like we were too proud of our technology or proud of what we created that we didn't recognize the limitations of that technology or the adverse events that came about. So a lot of technology fails because we don't anticipate the adverse events that can happen to patients. Sometimes in medicine, we take the ready, fire, aim strategy. We forgot to aim before we fired. Sometimes we take the strategy of ready, aim, 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 aim. We never fire. We never actually bring anything to fruition. So I think there's a fine balance between those two. When I look back at things that succeeded, the industry and the medicine providers at the bedside partnered very closely. Both partners listened to each other. They did not assume the other person was wrong, or they didn't let their ego get in the way. They listened to the adverse events that came up, even if they were so like out of the box. I never even thought that could happen. And then they adapted quickly. They set up quality measures. You have to have a really strong quality team. You have to have a really strong way of measuring quality, and you have to do something and react to the feedback you get. If all you do is do feedback and it goes into a bucket and no one ever answers that feedback, your technology is not going to survive.
I think you just did a great call to collaboration. Anybody who is listening to this podcast, who's still listening to this podcast at this point, like if that's you, get involved with us. Talk to us about these problems. Help us understand your perspective. These are enormously complicated problems that, as Erin said, affect every individual differently. And as Dan has also counseled me, one patient is one patient. And everybody's physiology can change for all sorts of different reasons. And we really need a large coalition to figure out how to address this.
So, as a follow-up, Erin, to that, are you seeing technology development speed up or slow down? It seems like everyone wants to speed up, AI everything and whatever, but we've also noticed that there are some technologies, particularly very invasive technologies, that are going to take forever, and we hear a lot of challenges around like particular shock registries or even studies because of consent and lots of things. So what are you seeing? Are things speeding up, slowing down, or staying the same?
Oh, that's a good question. That is a loaded question. So I'm going to do kind of three parts that I thought about this one a lot, because I think about this when I talk to every one of the industry partners we have. One is when industry has something really cool that they've created of any kind, and they are very siloed and they're very protective. I get it. You have to meet your stakeholders and all the things that go into it, but they don't collaborate with others, because one industry person may have something that matches to another's and they could marry so beautifully together, but they refuse to work together. So in that regard, we are very limited because we do not share, again, this collaboration that Casey just mentioned between providers, industry to industry also. The FDA needs to figure out ways to not be a block. And I think they're coming around, but there's a lot of reasons why cool technology started outside of the US, because there was less restrictions to get it off the ground. We need to be that. The United States needs to think forward and say, how can we expedite this? How can we make the FDA process faster, not unsafe, but quicker for everyone to bring an idea forward in a better way? And then you said about AI, and I love that question. At ISHLT this year, there was a phenomenal final debate, and you gotta love debates. But Shelley and Andres got together at the end, and it was AI. Should we use AI in transplant? And it was an amazing debate. But there is a role to make ourselves efficient. It brings in a lot of data to use AI. But again, the medicine is an art form, including nursing and physicians. So you need to be able to take that and then translate it and immediately become personal again. So AI has a place, but should not replace what we do. So I believe the marriage of these two technologies, the FDA making things faster and easier to actually bring to fruition for these patients, so we're not waiting forever and ever. And we need to all put our egos aside and actually agree that, are we here for the patients, or are we here for the money? So those are my thoughts.
Erin, I want to thank you again for spending some time with us today. You've been a great advisor and mentor and helped us really steer this ship forward. Thanks again for joining.
you so much.